Hello, my name is Ruth McKenna and I'm a PhD student at the University of Glasgow. I'm based within the Department of Central and East European Studies. My research looks at Russian migration to Scotland, specifically within the context of looking at how Russia is represented in Scottish and British newspapers and the impact that that might have on Russian migrants who are trying to sort of integrate and build a life in Scotland. The research is kind of organised into three stages. The first is a media analysis of 7 different newspapers, and so that's incorporating broadsheets and tabloids, national and local press, and looking at the kinds of words and topics that come up when Russia is written about, so building a picture of how Russia is presented in the media. The second part of the research involves talking to people who live in Scotland or who are from Scotland or who have lived in Scotland for a long time, and talking to them about how they see Russia, so the kinds of ideas that they might have about Russia. And what I'm interested in looking at is whether the way in which Russia is represented in the media affects sort of public perceptions and public attitudes towards Russia. The third part of the research, and I think possibly the most significant part of the research from a policy perspective, is looking at speaking to Russian migrants who live in Scotland. So obviously it's no surprise that the relationship between Russia and the UK is quite strained at the moment, and that's something that's really been compounded with the situation in Ukraine, and so that's led to quite a negative media environment about Russia. So what I'm interested in looking at is whether that affects Russian people who live here, and so whether people have kind of negative or hostile views about Russia or sort of stereotypes about Russia, and whether that affects Russian migrants who are trying to build a life here and sort of integrate here. And it might be that it doesn't affect them at all, but that's what I'm interested in finding out. So I think there are two kind of separate but related reasons that that this research could be useful to policymakers. The first relates to what I was saying before about the situation in Ukraine. So obviously the relationship between Russia and Britain has been deteriorating over the past decade, and that's really compounded with the situation in Ukraine. In tandem with that, Russian migration to the UK and to Scotland has been increasing. So there's this kind of juxtaposition between the fact that there's hostility at the state level, but there's still a movement of people from Russia and the former Soviet space to the UK and to Scotland. And so I think it's important for policymakers to be mindful of that fact, and to be mindful that Russian migrants who are trying to live here, who are bringing their families here or want to start a family here, could potentially be facing sort of knock-on hostility from that interstate conflict, and to look at ways to sort of mitigate that and to make sure that Russian people don't face sort of knock-on negative effects because of this conflict between Russia and Britain. Secondly, I think that sometimes migration policy can treat migrants as a sort of homogenous group. But I think that people from the post-Soviet space do face sort of particular barriers and can face particular difficulties. So to give an example, my master's research focused on the accessibility of the voluntary sector to Central and East European migrants. And one of the findings was that people were reluctant to volunteer because in the Soviet Union there were kind of days of forced volunteer work, which I know sounds like an oxymoron, but that people had to sweep leaves or shovel snow, and that these were compulsory activities. So that left people with a very specific understanding of what volunteering was and what it meant to volunteer, and so people were then reluctant to volunteer when they came to Scotland, which is a problem because if your visa sort of limits you from working, then volunteering is a really important way for migrants to practice their language skills and to kind of integrate and meet people within their community. And that was a very specific barrier faced by people coming from the post-Soviet space who had these very specific experiences. And so particularly at the local policy level, I think it's useful for policymakers to have some awareness of, and at best develop strategies to deal with the fact that migrants are not all the same and don't all face the same barriers, and sometimes face sort of very specific barriers based on their different sort of background or kind of cultural hang-ups. And there's really very limited academic engagement with Russian migration, particularly to the UK and to Scotland. I don't know of any other study that looks at Russian migration to Scotland, so it's a relatively recent phenomenon, and so I think from that perspective, sort of finding out about other potential barriers that people might face would be of value from a policy perspective, and particularly at that local policy perspective when people are dealing with migrants. There are growing Russian communities in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen, so particularly to councils there, I think the research could be valuable. Well, I love Russia, so I like talking to people about Russia and finding out different things, but I think that's probably what most people say about the research. Obviously, my research is focused on Russia and Scotland, so I always like to find out about new interesting connections between Russia and Scotland, of which there actually are a lot. A lot of the Jacobites fled to Russia after 1745 and became advisors to Catherine the Great, so that's nothing to do with my PhD, but I always like sort of finding out about Russian and Scottish sort of history.